If you're here today and you would consider yourself to be not a Christian, maybe this is your first time in church in a really long time, or maybe you've been coming to Newday for a while and you're still trying to figure out the whole Jesus thing, I just want to say I'm really glad you're here today, because I think that maybe today's message may have something to say to you today, because I've talked to lots of people over the years who have not become Christians because they believe that in order to become a Christian, they have to, maybe they knew a Christian who was close to angelic and really, really good, and they look at that person, they think that's what it means to be a Christian, and they say things like, I could never be that good, and so I don't think I could ever be a Christian. See, I met lots of people who told me the reason they're not followers of Christ is because they have issues in their life that they think would disqualify them from ever becoming a Christian. If that's at all a part of your experience, I'm glad you're here. And if you would consider yourself to be a follower of Christ, I'm glad you're here today too. Because I think today's message might have something to say to you as well. Because chances are, in your Christian experience, maybe you've done periods of assessment where you've kind of assessed where you are in your journey with Christ, and maybe you've looked back and you've kind of seen the things that God has done in your life and you've celebrated those things as you should. You see, I used to do this and I used to do that, and I don't do that anymore thanks to God, God's power in my life, and my life is better now because of that, and I never did this and I never did that, and now I'm doing those things and my life is enhanced because I'm doing those things, and we celebrate those things. But then we think of that one or two area of our lives that we realize are out of alignment with what we know God would want for us, and we know, I'm not supposed to be doing that, or I shouldn't be going there, or I shouldn't be watching that. And when you realize that you have that area in your life that's kind of out of alignment with God's intention for you, then you think things to yourself like, well, I just don't really think that God fully accepts me yet because I still have this area in my life. I don't think that God can fully use me yet or be in full relationship with me yet until I get that area kind of cleaned up and straightened out. We have this idea that God expects 100% devotion, and until we get to 100% devotion, God is going to withhold a part of himself from us until we are all in. Then he will be all in with us. And even as I say that, chances are many of you are thinking, well, yeah, of course that's the way it is. And the fact that you're talking about it as if it's not the way it is kind of making me nervous right now. But this summer, we're in a series called Finding Grace in Unexpected Places. And we've been looking at stories of grace, of people in the Old Testament who experienced grace in a variety of ways. And we're looking at what we can learn about grace based on these people's stories. And we're seeing that grace is a multifaceted concept or characteristic of God. And we're learning about what kind of relevance grace has in our lives today. And if you've missed any of the messages, no worries. You can go back and you go to our website and you'll find them all in audio or video format. You can download them or go to our iTunes, subscribe to our podcast. Make sure you leave a comment there. We'd love to have you do that. But what we're saying is that grace, first of all, is receiving from God something that we don't deserve, something good from God that we don't deserve. And we're saying that we're finding grace in unexpected places because when we think of the biblical concept of grace, many of us just go right to the New Testament or right to Jesus. We don't think about the Old Testament as being a place where we would find this concept of grace. You know, we have this idea of God in the Bible being the stern, somewhat vindictive, judgmental, mean even at times God, but then Jesus comes along and gives us this different picture of God or changes God's mind or whatever. And I can remember many times in my Christian experience of reading through the New Testament. Maybe I'll be reading stories of Jesus in the Gospels, or I'll be reading the writings of the Apostle Paul in Romans or Ephesians, and just being blown away by the concept of grace. But it was about 2 years ago, I was reading a very familiar story in the Old Testament when I was just blown away by the concept of grace. And this is the passage we'll be looking at today. I guess you could say I found grace in an unexpected place. And I've gone back and I've reread this story many times just to make sure I was getting it right. And again, every time I read it, I'm just like, wow, God is amazing. And I hope that you will be impacted by the story as I was. But the story is found in 1 Kings chapter 3. And it involves the third king of Israel, Solomon. So kids, if you want to count how many times you hear me say the name Solomon today, and just kind of keep track of that and take that number to the back afterwards, we'll have something for you. How many times do I say the name Solomon. All right, before we get into the passage, let's just do a little background. The story takes place in about 1000 BC, so about 3,000 years ago. And for centuries, Israel has been kind of bullied and pushed around, a weak nation, unable to stand up to the powerhouses around them. But then they established a monarchy. And their first king, Saul, had limited success against the powerhouses around them. But the second king, King David, was just blessed by God. He was given military success. He was given incredible prosperity and wealth, blessing from God, and he brought peace to Israel. So when our story starts in 1 Kings chapter 3, we find that King David had just died after a long and successful reign, and his son Solomon had just been named king. He is now the third king of Israel. And as we pick up the story, everything for Israel is kind of going up and to the right. The trend is upward. Everything is going great. Everything's going good for Israel, and they are on the cusp of their golden age under the reign of King Solomon. So that's where we pick up in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1. This is what the Bible says. It says Solomon, so it's kind of just introducing us here to Solomon and to his reign, kind of setting up the story of King Solomon. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because a temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. So, again, Solomon has just become king, and the inspired historian who wrote the book of 1 Kings is kind of setting up his reign by kind of giving us some background on Solomon, but also kind of foreshadowing what his reign would be like. And we see three things in these first two verses that kind of give us a kind of a foreshadowing of what Solomon's reign would be like. First of all, we see that one of the first things he does is he makes a political alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, by marrying his daughter. This is going to be something that is going to identify Solomon's reign. He is going to marry many, 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 many women, many of them from political alliances, all of them from different backgrounds, different countries, different religious orientations, right? That's going to be a part of who Solomon is. Next, we see that Solomon is getting ready to build. He's getting ready to build a palace. He's getting ready to build a temple. He's getting ready to build a wall around Jerusalem. Again, this is a foreshadowing of what Solomon's reign would be like. Solomon was a prolific builder. And then the third thing that we get right here at the beginning of Solomon's story is that this idea of high places and worshiping in high places. You get the sense that this is not a good thing. The people, however, were still sacrificing in high places. This too will be a theme not only for Solomon but for all of the kings and all of the people throughout the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. It keeps coming back again and again, and we'll come back to the idea of high places in just a minute. But let's continue in verse 3 as the writer kind of continues to give us a picture of what Solomon is like. We're getting to know Solomon here, what his reign is going to be like. Verse 3 says, Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David. That's good. If you've read these ancient texts of 1st and 2nd Kings, you know that it's basically the story of all these kings of Israel and later a divided kingdom of Israel and Judah. And it's a story of good kings and bad kings. It's a story of kings who loved God and followed God and led the people to love God and follow God, and bad kings who did evil things and worshipped idols and led the people to do the same. And so as each king is introduced, the writer of 1st and 2nd Kings seems to get it out right away. This is what kind of king this is. This is a good king, loved God, followed in the ways of David. David is kind of the standard for all the kings. Or this is a bad king, an evil king, didn't follow in the way of David, worshipped idols, wasn't faithful to God, right? And so right here at the very beginning of Solomon's story, we get a sense of what kind of king he was. And the writer tells us that Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David. Except that, okay, right there, red flag. If you're reading the text and you see something like that, you're like, wait a minute, what's going on? Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of David. Solomon loved God, except that. Now, those two ideas can't go together, can they? I mean, men, try this out. Go home today and talk to your wife if you're married and say something like, honey, I love you with all of my heart, except that. right? Or, baby, I'm going to be faithful to you all the days of my life, except that. That conversation is not going to go to a good place. Because those two concepts really should not be put together. That I love you, except that. I'm obedient to you, except that. Either you're wholehearted or you're not, right? There can't be an except that statement there. But there it is. Solomon loved the Lord, followed in the way of his fathers David, except that. Solomon had an area of his life that he was holding back from God. Solomon had an area of his life where he was out of alignment with God. We call this sin. It's disobedience. Solomon loved God, except that. And so if we were to kind of examine our hearts today, or allow the Holy Spirit to examine our hearts today, and I were to ask you, what is your except that issue? What would it be? Or issues, plural. I mean, inside of your, please don't say anything out loud here, but in your mind, think about answering this question, filling in this statement. And here's the statement. I am all in for God, except that what would you put in the blank? Again, we're not out loud here. What would I put in the blank? I'm all in for God, except that I still have a bit too much to drink on occasion. I'm all in for God, except that I really still have an issue with my temper and I lose it more than I should. I'm all in for God, except that in moments of weakness, I still find myself going to that porn site on the internet. I'm all in for God, except that I still go a little too far with my girlfriend or with my boyfriend. I'm all in for God. I love God with all my heart, except that I still rob him by withholding tithe, or I still overindulge, or except that I have a gambling problem. If you consider yourself to be a follower of Christ, someone who has received God's gift of salvation, someone who has committed to following Jesus, do you have and accept that area of your life? Because if you do, you have something in common with Solomon. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. You may wonder, well, what is the big deal about that? As a matter of fact, you may look at Solomon's accept that issue and say like, wow, mine's a lot worse than his is. And he makes me feel bad now because mine is worse than his is. But Solomon is doing something that God had made very clear he should not do. Worshiping in the high places had been forbidden. And that's because from the very beginning, high places were places that were dedicated to idol worship. It was typically a hill where people would go and they would worship their gods or their deities, presumably because they could be closer to their gods or their deities on these high places. And there would be an altar, or there would be a temple, or there would be a wooden or a stone statue in the shape of some god or deity, often very vulgar carvings. And where the Israelites were, the Canaanite high places were notorious for pagan worship, where people would do all kinds of just really horrible things. For instance, the god of Molech was one of the gods, the god of Moab. It was very common in Canaan. Molech would be worshipped in a high place, and very traditional with the worship of Molech would be sexual rituals as well as child sacrifice. And we believe that what would happen is they would have this idol of Molech, and it was a big, kind of a shaped like a man statue, and it was kind of hollow in the middle, and it had the head of a bull, big head of a bull, and it had a cut-out hole in the middle, and Molech's arms would kind of be shaped like this, and the hole would be in the middle, and they would put a fire inside of Molech's idol, and they would burn this fire, and they would get it going really hot, and there's Molech on fire, he's hot, and he has his arms out, and then parents would come and lay their infant children in the arms of Molech to burn to death. And these are the kind of things that are happening on high places, and it's for that reason that God told the Israelites that when they entered into the promised land, not only should they not have anything to do with the high places, but that they should destroy the high places, because these kind of things have been going on for hundreds of years. God didn't want his people and his worship the worship of God to be corrupted by or mixed with these kind of false religions, the surrounding false religions. And so he instructed his people, stay away from the high places, and I want you to worship in centralized places. I want you to worship all together. There's a sense of accountability there. For instance, in Deuteronomy, God says, be careful not to sacrifice your burnt offerings anywhere you please. Offer them only at the place the Lord will choose. Again, he wants centralized location. And that would ultimately become the place, wherever the Ark of the Covenant was, that was the place where they were to offer their sacrifice, and that was the place of worship. And now, for a while, the Ark of the Covenant kind of moved around, and so that centralized place of worship had moved. But now, in the days of Solomon, the Ark of the Covenant had come to Jerusalem, and there was a tent around it. And Solomon knew, this is the place where I'm supposed to be worshiping. Now, if you read the story, you know that the people didn't really obey this whole high place thing very well. They continued to go to the high places, and they continued to worship there, God's people. And for a while, it seems as though God kind of winked at their disobedience. He didn't make a big deal about it. Maybe for one, because they oftentimes were worshiping Him on those high places. Now, oftentimes they were worshiping idols, but other times they would worship Him on those high places. But again, now a place had been established in Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant was now in Jerusalem. Solomon knew this is now the place where we should be worshiping, but he doesn't. This is his accept that issue. He continues to worship on the high places. Let's continue in our story, going on to verse 4 of 1 Kings 3. The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place. Let's just kind of set the context here. In our story, Solomon is the new king. He is going off now to worship God in a high place, the place in his accept that area of his life. He is leaning in here to his disobedience. He's going to the place he knows he shouldn't be. That was the most important high place. And Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. He's a little zealous, isn't he? 1,000 burnt offerings. But sometimes when we know we're in disobedience in other areas, we kind of get a little overzealous. Have you ever known anybody like that? You know, they got that dark place in their life, so they're maybe a little overzealous. That's what Solomon's doing. And the story goes on. It says, at Gibeon, at the high place, as he is where he should not be, the Lord appears to Solomon during the night in a dream and said. All right, so again, before we go on, let's just kind of, again, make sure we got the context here. Solomon, his accept that area is worshiping on the high places. That is his area of disobedience. That is the place where he is out of alignment with God. And here in our story, he goes to the primary high place, the most famous high place, Gibeon. He is at a place where he should not be. Now, let's give him credit. He is worshiping Yahweh there. But he is worshiping Yahweh in the wrong way. And he is in his accept that place. He is in the area of his disobedience. And there at Gibeon, in the high place, God comes to him in a vision and speaks to him. Now, knowing what you know about the God of the Old Testament, what would you expect God to say to Solomon in this dream while he is in his place of disobedience? I mean, the God of the Old Testament is vindictive, and he is just looking for people to trip up, and so that he can, send the lightning bolt and smite them and all that, right? He is this angry God in the Old Testament, right? So we would expect God to say, something like, even if he's toning it down, Solomon, what are you doing here? Come on. You know better. Get your act straight before I zap you with a lightning bolt. I want to bless you and your nation, but I can't bless you until you bring all of you into alignment with me, until you are 100% devoted to me, until you get rid of these things that are out of alignment with me. That's what we'd expect God to say. But that's not what God says, because that's not what God is like. God comes to Solomon while he is at Gibeon, while he is in a place where he should not be, worshiping God in a way that he should not be worshiping him. And God says to Solomon in a dream, ask for whatever you want me to give you. Wow. Wow. Are you kidding me? Do you get this? Does this line up with your picture of God? While Solomon is doing what he shouldn't be doing in a place he isn't supposed to be doing it, God meets up with him and he says, I want to bless you. I want to bless you more than you can even imagine. I want to give you whatever you ask for. That's grace. God appears to Solomon in his place of weakness, in his place of disobedience, in his accept that issue. And he says, ask for whatever you want and I'll give it to you. That is marvelous, marvelous grace. What amazing goodness. What amazing faithfulness from God. God's grace leads him to give us what we don't deserve. When we're doing things that actively disqualify us from those things that he wants to give us. His grace leads him to meet us where we are, even in disobedience, and bless us right there in our accept that place. Let me just say, this aspect of God's grace has lots of implications. I'd just like to point out a couple. First of all, if you're one of those people who thought you had to have your life all cleaned up before you kind of entered into a relationship with God, I hope you see that's not the case, because even his people have issues, accept that issues, areas of disobedience in their lives. Even though their lives may look like they have it all together, there are issues going on, and God meets us in those areas. He doesn't wait for us to kind of be 100% devoted before he'll be 100% devoted to us. He's already all in. And I hope you see that if you're a follower of Christ and you've just been beating yourself up over that one issue that God hasn't yet fully dealt with yet, that area of your life that is still out of alignment, I hope you see that God still meets us 100%, even in those areas, and comes to us and says, I still want to bless you more than you could even imagine. I am totally for you, as I was for Solomon. Now, this is a dangerous teaching. I realize that. But it strikes me that grace is a dangerous aspect of God's character that could so easily be abused. I mean, we could read this story in the life of Solomon, and we can see how God overlooks Solomon's disobedience and blesses him in spite of it. And then we can just hang all the tighter to our accept that issue. Right? Because if Solomon got to keep his, I'm keeping mine too. Right? If God blessed him, God will bless me too, even as I hold on to whatever this issue is in my life. Or even worse yet, maybe you don't even have one of those issues in your life, but now you're like, I'm going to go get one because I feel like I'm missing out because Solomon had one, everyone else seems to have one. I want an issue too. God will still bless me even in my issue, so I'm going to go get one. But grace, listen, grace, again, isn't a loophole. When God exhibits his grace to us, the way he did to Solomon, again, it's intended to be a picture. It's intended to be a window into his heart. And God shows us this kind of grace in order to draw us to him. The intention is that God will meet us in our accept that area, in our disobedience, as we're out of alignment, and he'll bless us while we are there, so that we will then bring that area to him and say, if you're that good, take it. And deal with it. Make me like you because you are so attractive. And this is exactly what happens for Solomon, at least initially. This is amazing. Solomon experiences this grace from God. He realizes, he knows he's in a place where he shouldn't be. He's worshiping God in a way he shouldn't be. That's why he had the 1,000, that's what I think, that's why he had the 1,000 offerings, trying to make up for his disobedience. But he experiences this grace of God. And he is so blown away that he is about to have his greatest moment. I mean, this is going to be Solomon's highest point of his life, I believe, because of the grace that he experiences. And if you know the rest of the story, God comes to him and says, ask for whatever you want, and then Solomon says, hey, I'm young, I'm king, I'm not equipped for this, give me wisdom. I need wisdom to be able to lead these people well. And God is so impressed with Solomon's request for wisdom that he didn't ask for, riches or power or the death of his enemies or any of those things. He says, I'm going to make you the wisest person who ever lived, and I'm going to give you power and influence, and I'm going to give you riches, and I'm going to give you a long reign. Now, how does Solomon respond to this grace? What does he do? First thing, he wakes up from this dream. It says in verse 15, then Solomon awoke and realized it had been a dream, but God had spoke to him in this dream. He returned to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. He experiences grace, and what does he do immediately? He says, I'm out of alignment. I'm coming into alignment. The first thing he does is he leaves the high place, goes to the place where he's supposed to worship, and he worships in the way God asked him to. That's what grace is supposed to look like. that is so powerful, that is so attractive, that God would be so good, so patient, so loving, that he would just woo me in. And we would say, hey, whatever this God asks for, I'm willing to give it. If he asks me to do something, if he asks me to give him something, he asks me to stop doing something, whether I agree with him, whether I understand why, I'm willing to do it because a God this good deserves all of me. And that's what happens for Solomon. He says, I'm out of here. Goodbye, Gibeon, back to Jerusalem in front of the Ark of the Covenant. This is the way God said to do it. I'm going to do it because I am that grateful. He surrenders his accept that issue to God. This is the intended outcome of grace. But we know many make the decision to abuse grace, and we take it as permission to do whatever we want, and God gives us the freedom to do that too. And unfortunately, that's what ends up happening for Solomon. You know, initially he has this kind of little mini conversion, and he's so overwhelmed by God's grace. He goes and he does things right. But it seems that he continues to lean into his weaknesses, lean into his kind of area of disobedience, lean into his accept that issues. And it's not long before he kind of goes down the slippery slope of compromise and sin. And you know, I got to tell you, sin is like that. If you haven't discovered that yet, you probably have. I have. Sin by nature is progressive. What starts as something so small, as we continue to give into it, becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. If we don't surrender our sin to God, when we have the opportunity for him to kind of deal with it, it grows in our lives until it completely takes over. You know, what starts as a little decision can ultimately end in a kind of a prison of bondage that destroys us if we don't give it to God. And this is what happens for Solomon. Those issues that the writer of Kings kind of foretold in the first couple of verses of chapter 3 end up being Solomon's downfall. He ends up being ruined by his accept that issues. God loves him. God wants to bless him. God continues to bless him. But it ruins him. It says in 1 Kings, just a couple of chapters later, in 1 Kings chapter 11, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. Just a little side here. Young people, single people, as you choose a future spouse, as you begin to date, keep this in mind, Solomon, and the New Testament teaching of being equally yoked, that if you are seeking to date somebody, that they be a follower of Christ. Not just somebody who says, oh yeah, I'm a Christian, but you don't ever see them following Christ in their life. And I know that we all probably know stories of, I had this one friend that they were a Christian, they married someone who wasn't a Christian, and then that person became a Christian. They lived happily ever after, and I know those stories too, and I celebrate those. I've been involved in lots of those stories. Praise the Lord, I love it when I'm able to lead an unbelieving spouse to Christ. But we all also know lots of stories that don't end that way. And where we say, well, we'll just wait and see what God does, and God gives that person choice, and that person chooses never to come to the Lord, and that either ends in a person trying to follow God in isolation and in misery, or it leads in someone falling away from God altogether. Follow the Lord's counsel as you start your relationships, and be equally yoked. Find someone who's running hard after God, just as hard as you are. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, yes, that Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Solomon's story doesn't end so well. I mean, after all that he experienced, after the grace he had experienced, after the way God had blessed him so much, even in his disobedience, he sees it as permission to continue to live out of alignment with God's will. And I don't know. You know, we often think that the God of the Old Testament is just too hard. But the more I read the Old Testament, I think he's too soft. I mean, maybe he shouldn't be so lenient, because every time he is patient with people and lenient and shows grace, it backfires. I mean, maybe there should be more lightning bolts. Maybe there should be more judgment in the Old Testament. Maybe these people would be more faithful. But that's not God's nature. It's not his character. He is grace. He is patient. He is long-suffering. So what's our takeaway today? I hope you see that the God revealed in the Old Testament and the New is a God of patience. He is so gracious. He doesn't wait for you to kind of get your act together before he's going to kind of welcome you into his family. He doesn't wait for you to kind of reach perfection before he finally accepts you fully. So let's just embrace this reality. Let's wrap our minds around this. Just think about your experience right now, where you are. Think about your accept that issues. Whatever the case may be, whether it's issue or issues plural. Think about the feelings of guilt and self-condemnation that we all carry around, thinking that that's the way God feels about us too. Or thinking that I can't come to him because I still have this issue, when all the while he's right there saying, I'm here and I want to bless you. Let's wrap our minds around this truth. God came to Solomon in a dream and said, I'll do whatever you want me to do for you, while he was at the greatest high place. God came to him in his disobedience and said, let me bless you. This is the heart of God. This is the way God sees you. He accepts us all right where we are, right now. He loves us right where we are, right now. And he wants to meet us in our accept that issue. But then what will we do with that grace? That's our choice. Will we allow it to draw us to him, to woo us to him, to surrender more of us to him? Or will we use it as permission to continue to cling to our accept that issues that will then lead to our own self-destruction? It just occurs to me, this is the way God always works. That he comes to somebody in the midst of disobedience, blesses them, and then says, now it's your choice. What will you do with my grace? When Jesus came to earth, he chose 12 men to be around him, and he didn't choose 12 perfect people. But he came to 12 men in the midst of their accept that issues. And he said, I choose you. He chose guys like Judas to be one of his 12, a guy who wanted to follow God, accept that. He had a little problem with greed and stealing things and telling people what to do and criticism. He chose Peter, a man who loved God, accept that. He was stubborn and somewhat vulgar and thought he knew how to do things better than God did. But Jesus met both of them in their disobedience, and he called both of them, and he gave them both purpose, and he revealed grace to both of them. And the more grace Judas saw from Jesus, the more he thought, I'll just keep going the way I'm going, until he ends up betraying Jesus and selling him for 30 pieces of silver. Judas goes the way of Solomon. But Peter, the more grace he sees, the more of his issues he surrenders to Jesus, until Peter finds himself in a place of complete transformation. That's what God wants for all of us. And so God, right now, God is demonstrating grace to you, whatever your circumstances. He's revealing his goodness to you. He's blessing you in the midst of disobedience. He loves you in the midst of disobedience. There are no perfect people in his plan. All of us are out of alignment. But he gives us the choice as to what we're going to do with that grace. And so let me just close with this. If you have never received entered into a relationship with Christ before because you just didn't think you were good enough, or that God would accept you, or maybe you've been away from him that long that you're just like, I just don't think I could go there. Think again. I mean, look at how God dealt with Solomon in his disobedience, and take that as an invitation to all of us, to you, to say yes to a God who would be that good to somebody out of alignment with him. And he wants to be that good to us. He wants to be in relationship with you. And my prayer for you is, if you are not currently in a relationship with Christ, that you would just be wooed by his grace today. And that at the end of the service, when we invite you to come forward, where we'll have prayer counselors, that you would come forward and just tell somebody today, I want to trust God. Pray for me. It's my prayer for you that you'd do that. Or if you're someone who is already following Christ and you're just carrying around this baggage of guilt and shame because you just can't get it all right, I hope you'd see God's heart for you today. He is with you now. He is blessing you now. And you don't need to carry it around feeling guilty. You just need to offer it to him and say, you deal with it. It's your issue, not mine. But his grace is that deep. And it's that real.